these two series, we've delved into energy in your building, how it works, and focusing on the three ownership models within a building, the implications on your purchasing arrangements, and finally explored opportunities that exist for schemes to procure a better deal from the infrastructure they own. So Damien, what is the ideal procurement structure to maximise energy savings in strata?
Okay, scheme or property owner ownership of the electricity account for the entire site and retention of the infrastructure, including those renewable assets, is by far the best pathway to generating long-term savings and income streams. For existing schemes, there are also finance options available that fund the refurbishment of tied infrastructure along with that enable the scheme to pay down the loan and generate that income derived whilst maintaining ownership of that infrastructure.
Yeah, that's right. And as we explored in parts 1 and 2, it was that part ownership or full ownership of the scheme that provided the best cost-effective method. And ultimately, most schemes out there are Western Power meter direct. So that's where there's a huge opportunity in that market for a lot of strata owners to look at their electrical infrastructure and how they might better utilise that infrastructure to generate an income.
Yeah, the complete ownership model, also mentioned and referred to as an embedded network, that model's existed since 1993 and was actually introduced by SEQA, which was the State Energy Commission at the time, and legislated later in 2005 via the introduction of the Electricity Act, which gave properties an exemption from needing requiring a licence to sell electricity. And the property sector has successfully self-regulated energy allocation and billing since that time to internal consumers, both for the occupants and for the common area, which is also got to be distributed. Costs for those areas need to be distributed also.
Okay, so what are the first steps I need to take if I'm looking at driving energy efficiencies?
Okay, if you're currently a Synergy / Western Power managed site, you can look at a feasibility where we can analyse the overall energy consumption and give you a feasibility of what benefit would the cost benefit of converting to an embedded network, which includes looking at that infrastructure, which is critical because if you've got to upgrade infrastructure, those costs need to be factored into the cost benefit analysis. And in addition, you can deploy a solar feasibility where once you take ownership of that asset, the solar can benefit everyone, so you can combine that into the cost benefit analysis.
So most solar installers don't fall into that category of expertise that can really determine the base build infrastructure within a scheme. For a scheme to want to progress and introduce sustainable infrastructure and solar, the owners will really want to be able to take comfort that someone with the necessary expertise has analysed what the base build infrastructure is and what it's capable of supporting, and then provide a feasibility model around, well what's the payback in going down this path and making this investment? Is it a worthwhile return for us? And generally, we're actually finding, where we've actually done this in the schemes which we manage, you're seeing anywhere between a 3 to 6 year payback on the investment, which is a great opportunity for owners, medium term, to then have this income coming in to then be able to look to upgrade and continually provision for additional solar batteries and of course EVs, as we've also spoken about.
Great. So who are the best people to conduct these feasibilities into potential savings and returns?
Well, I've been lucky enough to work with Damien for a number of years. We first came together on the Property Council probably about 8 years ago, and I've really found that the level of detail they provide in their feasibility reports covers often everything that the owners need to know. And it's easy to understand because there's some detail you can provide in there which will just go over your owners' heads, but they've really simplified it down to make it easy for owners to understand. They've provided a level of analysis which gives you the comfort that they've really looked at where some limitations may exist and what the opportunities may be, and really made it quite simple for an owner to make a decision. And if you're wanting to be able to progress this through a scheme, you're going to have to take it to a general meeting, and the owners are going to have to vote on it. They're not going to have that confidence to vote on the motion if they don't have a detailed feasibility plan to support the motion that's been put up. And that's the benefits we've found with using Energy Tech and the reports they provide.
That's great. Okay, so Scott, what key risks do you see in the field when performing feasibilities for potential embedded network conversions?
Yeah, we've spoken about this a lot, and it's antiquated electrical infrastructure. A lot of the older schemes, they'll have asbestos backboards. So it might be more than just an analysis of the electrical infrastructure. You may have to think about an asbestos report. You also have to think about, well, where's this infrastructure going? Is it going on the roof, putting on the carports? Where your battery's going, which we've spoken about. So you need to look at potentially a structural report as well. Is the roof structurally sound? Can it support a solar array? Where are we going to accommodate future upgrade maybe for battery? Battery needs to be well ventilated to get the most out of battery, ideally covered. Not leaving it exposed to the elements is the best opportunity there. So where can look to do this within your scheme? You also need to think about the other elements of your electrical infrastructure, like your RCDs. You don't want someone going along and playing in your electrical cupboard if the RCDs aren't up to scratch, and that might also lead to thermal imaging scan of your electrical infrastructure, which can really pinpoint where there might be some exposed wiring and some heat points within your electrical infrastructure. And so a thermal imaging scan can really also help you better understand the health of your electrical infrastructure.
Yeah, the benefit and the opportunity of a conversion often raises questions about infrastructure that has been long-standing issues with that infrastructure. It might be the condition of that infrastructure and maybe well beyond its life cycle in some cases. And often, especially for the sites that are where Synergy is the retailer, there's no incentive for the scheme to actually upgrade because they don't get any of the benefit. It will be what it is now in the future. Whereas by converting to an embedded network and using that opportunity and point in time to upgrade that old antiquated infrastructure, they've future-proofed the asset for the next 25 plus years. And that's where Scott suggested provisioning for solar, provisioning for battery, planning where EVs might go, and setting that foundation of a plan that you may not press the button on any time soon, but when the time comes, you've done the research and you've got that provisioning in place, which means you don't have to shut the building down multiple times in the future because you've thought about it at the beginning.
Excellent. Okay, so Scott, tell us about what financing options are available for embedded network conversions.
Getting to the point there, aren't you? I guess and that's what it all comes down to. It's dollars and cents, and I guess you've got a couple of different options out there. One, the scheme may have cash reserves there. They might have a strong reserve and be able to pay for it themselves, and therefore there isn't a need to explore a finance option. The other option, you've got like a hire purchase model, and this is effectively where the specialist embedded network provider will come in and undertake the works and provide a fee for service model, which includes sort of the hire back financing of the equipment and the pay down of the investment that the owners make, so that at the end of that payback period, the owners then own the infrastructure that they've commissioned the installer to provide. The other models, you've got financing. There's a lot of lenders out there now in the strata sector, and they'll offer unsecured loans. You do pay a little bit of a higher rate because they're unsecured, but some lenders are looking at providing a slightly competitive rate where it's sustainable investment. They also can take a little bit more comfort when they see a good feasibility model that can show how it's paying for itself. Like, as we've talked about, we've got a scheme, it's about a $400,000 investment, but first year income profit is 90,000. So within 4.5, 5 years, it's paid off. So that can also give the lender a lot more comfort when it comes to lending, and you might be able to argue for a slightly more competitive rate. And then your final option is going to a third-party provider. If the scheme doesn't want to have to take it all on, it can be a very complicated process. They can look to engage with a third-party provider, and the third-party provider will then come in and put in the infrastructure. They'll pay for the infrastructure. They'll have to sign all the individual owners up to a supply agreement, so that the owners have to agree that that third party is going to be billing them and providing them the utility. So you have to understand that as well. But as we've explored, there is still some savings the owners may realise by going down that path with a third party. Hopefully you can see a slightly lower rate than the gazetted tariff rate, and you may find the third party provider would also provide a rebate back to the strata company for the opportunity to come in and do that. But you're not going to see anywhere near the 25 to 30% return you could get if the scheme steps in there and takes, and progresses towards full ownership of the infrastructure.
Right.
And it is very important to understand that regardless of these models, that the scheme is still responsible for that foundation infrastructure, the switchboards, the cabling, the distribution boards. All of those still come with maintenance risk, and maintaining reliable supply and continual supply, as well as insurance costs, all still sit with the scheme. So it's always should be in their best interests to focus their model on actually getting a return for that investment.
So Damien, what are the sustainable infrastructure options?
Sure. So there's four major assets: the metering infrastructure, the solar assets, the battery assets, and the EV charging. All of those are what are the hot topics and what are of most interest. And the main reason is because each one of them has an impact on revenue and income, and are all add-ons to the foundation infrastructure that we've spoken about. Metering's a really interesting one because our energy market has evolved, but most buildings' metering is still original. And so you've got, with solar energy, you've got more than one point of supply into the building, and it's like having, you relate it to water, where you've got a rainwater tower and you've got the grid water that comes from the street connection. You can't tell when you open your tap which is which. But from a billing perspective, you need to be able to do that, and you need to be able to allocate those costs. And especially as the green revolution takes more shape, emissions is going to be important, and people are going to want to know where did that solar go? Did I get benefit? Did someone else get benefit? What about the emissions, carbon trading? All of those elements mean that you have to be able to account for it and reconcile. So metering systems have to be capable of measuring bidirectional energy flow inside a network, and so that's very tricky, but that's what technology exists now, and if meters are programmed appropriately with current technology, they're capable of doing that. So you can account for it very well. So if the whole strategy should be to deploy a very sound metering infrastructure, especially if it's old and antiquated first, then deploy the solar, because then you can track the solar, you can identify who's consuming it and who's using it. Then battery, which means that you've got solar generation during the day, but as we've mentioned in the evenings, sunsets, that's when peak time is going to be the big issue. That's when electricity in the future is going to be the most expensive, because they will call it a peak period. So energy will be cheap in the middle of the day, expensive in the evening, and then possibly expensive at night when everyone's plugged in their cars because they're at home now. So all of those elements tie into having solar first, while even now the return on benefit is sound. Provisioning for battery, which is two things. It's storing that solar energy during the day, and then deploying it in the evenings in those peak periods, which means you're not paying those peak prices, or what they call arbitrage, where you're buying electricity from the grid cheaply at off-peak times, and then just deploying it at peak times. And that will make a big difference. And then all of these assets actually lead towards EV charging, which is basically a much larger consumption of energy, moving from the Bowser to the PowerPoint. That shift is going to be massive, as we've mentioned before. It's going to increase the electricity consumption in buildings that have EV chargers, 5, 6, 7-fold on what we see now, especially if you've got more than one car. Especially if you want fast charging versus trickle feed, so the combination of convenience versus cost, because energy is about 20% of the cost of petrol. So it's cheap to buy electricity to charge your car, but they're more expensive at the moment. So as EV charges come down, the interest will be greater. But without that infrastructure in the background, having the right metering, having deployed solar, having built that battery arbitrage capability, the EV could be a real problem for buildings. And that's what we're facing at the moment. We've got clients that want EV now, EV charging now, but they haven't built that infrastructure. And so they're already at points where they're like, well, we can't. What do we have to do? Start at ground zero, which is metering, solar, battery.
Fascinating.
And schemes they need to start looking at now. We've already spoken about it in the previous 2 series, and this is where their focus has to be. They have to have a strategy now around their electrical infrastructure and their sustainable infrastructure. As we've mentioned, in the next 10 years, 50% of the cars on the road will be electric vehicles. So that's 50% of cars in the schemes that may be electric. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. You can't just quickly turn on and say, okay, we're now installing EV chargers. So that's why we really have to draw attention to it today and make people aware that you can't just keep sitting back and saying that she'll be right, mate, which is what we always do. We have to start thinking about a plan towards it and really starting to provision, look at where your electrical infrastructure is sitting. And if you're doing that, well, how can we value add to that electrical infrastructure? What are the opportunities to actually turn it into a cost and make it an income generator? And that's what this is all about.
So important, isn't it? So, Scott, how does electrical demand capacity affect an embedded network conversion?
Well, a capacity upgrade is a separate undertaking to installing an embedded network. Every property, when you make an application to build a scheme, you make an application to Western Power on what the anticipated supply requirements will be for the lots in that scheme. So for new schemes now, the developers are allowing for future EV, but for going back a few years ago, they weren't allowing for EV. And so therefore we're finding that schemes are limited to their ability to draw more from the Western Power grid. And owners, in going down this path of wanting to convert to an embedded network, really the first step is well, what's our capacity currently, and part of the feasibility analysis will be going to Western Power and say, well, what's the maximum draw we can now take from the substation, if we want to increase our draw, and that may fast track addition of solar and battery to the scheme, because in the end, our first step is looking at the conversion to an embedded network and getting the metering in, and even the new meters will provide a more efficient model. You'll actually save some energy from just putting in the better meters that we've now got available in the market, as opposed to the old antiquated Western Power meters. So there is that benefit as well. But we need to, you need to look at what is your limitations, what's the maximum capacity you can draw, and build that into your strategy around where you need to take that energy infrastructure upgrade.
Yeah, it's very much at a tipping point where if you need to ask Western Power for that increase of capacity, often they'll want you to pay for that transformer. And that transformer might be $1 million. And so would you invest $1 million in upgrading that so you can get more electricity from the grid at a more expensive price, or would you invest that $1 million in solar and battery solution behind the meter that might end up a third the cost, but similar generation? Although some of the risk falls onto you as the owner now, because you're generating energy that is, or part of the solution, I guess. However, if you focus that on things like unnecessary stuff, like you could say, we've got power issues, no EV charging today, versus the essentials in a home. So decisions like that may need to be made in the future. But there's lots of efficiency measures that buildings and property owners can do in the types of assets they use. It's household appliances, it's lighting, that they can focus in on retrofitting those elements to LED from 240 volt light globes, from efficient air conditioning systems from the older styles, from a lot of plug-in appliances. A lot of those are more efficient now. So often those sorts of strategies can reduce the load anyway on a premises if they have a coordinated effort and make that available capacity potentially for, say, EV chargers and the like.
Fantastic. There's some great tips in there, guys. So, Scott, what's the major inhibitor you see facing schemes looking into embedded network conversions?
The WA energy sector, it's complicated. And it's hard for owners to really understand where their power is actually coming from, and then what can they do about it, and so therefore partnering with the right people to help close that gap and help them better understand how it all works is really important. It's also important, that they understand there's a lot of misinformation out there as well, and people are getting sold products which really long term might not be fit for purpose, and it often owners don't understand, and they might be skipping a few steps by just jumping straight to solar, or let's put a battery in straight away, and not understanding that that might just be benefiting the common power of the scheme, and really are they going to get the payback? Whereas if they really do a deep dive into it, look at the opportunity of an embedded network and how the sustainable infrastructure could benefit the whole scheme, they'll be better prepared. And there's also just understanding the limitations of the base build infrastructure. When you've got a solar provider, they're just coming in to really look to sell your solar and put it on the roof. Is it really the right step to take first, or are there other elements you need to consider first? The other thing is understanding the ownership models, which we've spoken about. In buying into a scheme, understand who owns the sustainable infrastructure, and are there going to be some legacy problems, or there are going to be future negotiations that are going to have to be had if there's a third-party ownership model in play. Now, most of these third-party ownership models were aimed at the eastern states, and so it was aimed at procuring an income generation asset with the property and leaving the operational risk to the owner. And this is, I think what we're starting to see. The third parties came into the market around about 5 to 8 years ago. So we're just starting to reach the end of some of their agreements now. And so owners are now, where they've got a third party in play, just understanding that they now need to sit down and renegotiate those contracts. And I think it's something that they actually were completely unaware of, was that they don't actually own the solar on the roof, and they might not own the EV charger in the visitor bay. Therefore, they're now at a difficult point in that negotiation where really the third party owner holds all the cards. So, and I'm not having a go at the third parties. Will negotiate in good faith, but I just feel if you're buying into the scheme, there's sort of an expectation at some point in time you're going to own all your infrastructure, and this is where I think today, in negotiating those agreements, which is primarily comes back to the developers, they should be looking to negotiate an agreement with an end term where all of that infrastructure reverts back to the ownership of the scheme. I guess that's where there's a great opportunity, and really it comes down to it's the willingness of the owner to better inform themselves. and to partner with the right people if they really are serious about driving these initiatives.
Yeah, there's a bit to consider. So, Damien, what advice do you have for schemes considering an embedded network conversion and or solar deployment?
Sure. So I suppose the initial bit is understand what your current arrangements are, and that's really why we've put this 3-part series together, is to try to help people understand the options and which one they actually sit within right now. Once they understand that, they can see a little bit what alternatives are available to them. And then heading down that path would flow into the analytical phase, which is doing a feasibility and identifying what those cost benefits are, understanding what the cost benefits are. That flows into generally a preliminary plan, which is okay, that's a feasibility, but let's get some hard costings and let's frame this up into a project and a strategy that would ultimately flow into making sure the right bylaws are in place. And that the whole legal element has been taken care of properly to reflect the requirements of the most recent Strata Act, and then finally rolling into a project implementation and the work's being done and setting a plan for that. Secondly, consider converting to an embedded network before deploying solar. Large-scale solar the benefits of large-scale solar only become evident once an asset's configured as an embedded network and the whole scheme can derive a benefit. Thirdly, ensure you can clearly reconcile energy within the building, and that means that you need adequate metering to do that. And fourthly, upgrade that metering infrastructure if it's outdated, because the energy industry has changed and antiquated metering, especially with future tariffs, being able to pay for electricity as a scheme and then pass on the tariff infrastructure to suit that future space that we're talking about. The A1 tariff will change in the future, and it will accommodate more around the peak periods when energy is most expensive, like those evenings. So the meter has to be capable of allowing the scheme to pass on those peak period benefits, and we call that time of use metering. The fifth is when it comes to sourcing funding, making sure that funding solution results in the scheme ultimately owning the assets, that you haven't given away all of these income generation assets inadvertently.
There you have it. It seems the embedded network opportunity is only limited by the willingness of the strata manager and the council of owners to educate themselves and their co-owners on cost benefits and the best solution for their scheme. If you want to learn more or look to partner with either Damien or Scott on helping explore and manage your scheme's conversion to an embedded network, please don't hesitate to email them. We'd like to thank you for watching the series, and Scott and Damien for your time.
Thanks, Lana.